welcome back. We are back for the second time in a while. Won't go through that whole spiel again this week, but it is good to be back. And just a whole lot going on in everyone's personal lives, and a lot of things that I've got going on here lately. But mostly what really caught my attention this week was a new book has come out. And anyone who knows me knows I love a good book. I've not read this. When I say a good book, I say that very loosely because the name of it is called White Roll Rage. It's written by two different individuals, and of course you can kind of gather that the two who wrote it are not pro-Trumpers. And we're not going to be talking about being pro-Trumpers today, but I definitely, there's just a few things that caught my attention about it, and what they were talking about. Anyway, before we get there, though, this is your host Tom Paul Tipton, and Michael, say hello to everyone.
Hello, all our followers and listeners. Glad that you're with us. Hope you're having a great day, and hope we impart you with some knowledge or at least some topics for discussion.
And absolutely, always feel free. Again, I'm going to say it again. I say this every time. And again, feel free to ask questions. We are not going to, we will by no means put anybody down. Please, if you disagree with us, feel free. This is why it's called The Exchange, because we want an exchange of opinions. But this book come out, and it's written by two individuals, Tom Schaller and Paul Waldman. And Schaller, we'll just call him Schaller for lack of not knowing how to pronounce that last name, is a professor of political science at the University of Maryland, which probably tells you a lot. And the other, he is an opinion writer. And we all know what they say about opinions, and this guy's definitely got one. White Roll Rage is the name of the book. And what he's talking about, and kind of pick up the pace here a little bit, the point of the book is, why are white rural voters a threat to democracy at this point? Now, I want to go ahead and stop. The moment that a talking figurehead uses the word democracy, I do some teaching for elementary, and about 2 or 3 months ago, I had this fourth grader, maybe in third, but I believe it was fourth, asked a question that you don't even hear most adults ask, because they still start the day off with the Pledge of Allegiance, and he asked a question. Just out of the clear blue. And you know what question I'm going to?
Got hung up with the Republic.
To the Republic for which it stands. And he goes, and apparently, I would assume, because the school is made up primarily of students who are military kids. And so, most military people are not necessarily open politically, as you know. I mean, you've been in the military. Yeah. But he asked the question, so I would assume that his parents are news hounds. And so he asks that question, and it stumped, because I was actually just in the classroom that day as a teacher not a teacher's assistant. I wasn't in there teaching the class, and it stumped the teacher. And
isn't that reassuring?
Well, because everybody, and he uses it there, everyone wants to use that word democracy. And very few people, and was it Benjamin Franklin who described the difference? I believe it was Franklin, the difference between a democracy and a republic. Do you remember what that phrase was? I remember it's two wolves fighting over.
Not off the top of my head.
But it's something along the lines of two wolves arguing over one sheep. And that is because when you look at a democracy, one of the best and easiest ways to explain a democracy is that a democracy is primarily it's majority ruled. And you say, well, that sounds great. But Greece was the best. They were a true democracy because every vote counted. And when I say that, I'm not trying to imply, and obviously we're talking because we got election coming up. Everybody's hearing about election, and I'm not giving an endorsement for either political party on this podcast. But we've got an election coming up, and everyone wants to say that, you know, votes don't matter in our country, and that's not true. They do matter. But we chose Hamilton, which you remember the play, the musical that came out a few years ago called Hamilton?
Yes.
And most of the people that were all pushing it and big supporters of it were, they absolutely hate the Electoral College. But Hamilton's the one who gave us the Electoral College, right?
Yeah.
This is why history's so important, because he's the one who gave us the Electoral College. Explain that a little bit, Michael. I know you know quite a bit about it. I mean,
well, so the Electoral College, you have to get there's a threshold that you have to surpass in order to win the presidency. But the way it works is you have representatives from each state that are supposed to vote along what the average voter chose. Mm-hmm. The reason originally that they had done it is some of the founding fathers didn't think that the average voter was intelligent enough to make the right decision.
Right.
And so, and honestly, sometimes that's not too far from the truth.
Not to disagree with what you're saying, that might be a little unfair. Let me say this, and I'll appeal to your policeman side of things. It's kind of the good cop, bad cop. I'm not trying to argue that. Do you think it's that they didn't think that they were smart enough? Because we got a lot of, we got people, women that are going to listen to this, and they may take umbrage with that because then they're going to want to, go to the women's suffrage movement. And a lot of it is that they didn't want non-landowners voting, right?
Well,
or was it really just intelligence?
I think there was a split. If you go back and read a lot of the documents that they wrote around the time, there was a split between they didn't think that the average voter could make the appropriate decision, but there was also a faction that wanted to make sure that everyone was properly represented.
Yeah.
Because the other thing that it serves is to make sure that marginalized groups like rural states don't get they're not trampled by populous states like New York
right.
or some of these other places that have a high population concentration.
And probably the best example of that is California and New York.
Yeah.
Both of those states are heavily blue states, and when you look at how they're, and of course, I think the states best break down why that the populist vote is not the best way to go nationwide for a president.
Yes, because you will have possibly a majority of the states that want to go with a particular candidate, but
yes.
you have several weighty, very populous states that can skew it in the opposite direction.
Right.
Of the overwhelming majority as far as the number of states, but not necessarily the number of voters.
Well, and when you go back to the way the election is, the way the election was in the early days, and I don't have that in front of me right now, but the thing is that there were a lot of women, especially in Pennsylvania, that voted. There were even some people that black people that voted as well. And Danielle says hello. Hello, Danielle. Thank you for joining the podcast. But the thing is that voting was not restricted, and as you said, they did not feel that Americans were smart enough. That is one of the reasons why Thomas Jefferson said that Americans get it wrong a lot, but they eventually get it right. And even though they didn't necessarily feel that the American people were smart enough to make the best choices, thank God they still left that choice in their hand.
Yeah.
And I had this conversation with somebody a couple of weeks ago. I think that, I'm not saying that we need to go back to necessarily just landowners voting, but I would say that if you can't prove that you have a job and are paying taxes, you probably shouldn't be able to vote.
Well, so the big problem I have now is this push for people who don't have IDs or can't even prove who they are, allowing them to vote. The problem I have with that is I could go into one polling place, give them an address, tell them my name is, just make up a name. My name's John Smith. And then I go right around the corner to another polling location. I could just vote indefinitely. And if I'm unemployed, I could literally spend all day voting for a particular candidate.
Right. And, and talking about what we're talking about this morning, excuse me, or this afternoon rather, this book comes out, White Rural Rage, and they're making the case that rural voters are the biggest threat to democracy. For those that are just joining, we're talking about White Rural Rage, a book that has just recently come out, and I'm going to let you get to this in just a second, but I kind of want to go back because you and I both are historians. It's what we studied primarily. A lot of people talk about, who don't know anything about the South, a lot of people talk about how that Southerners are very cliquish. They're very closed off to the rest of the country. And I kind of want to talk about this too, because we just ended Black History Month, and I agree with what Morgan Freeman said. You can go on YouTube and watch it. He's having an interview with Chris Wallace, and Morgan Freeman asks him about wanting a Black History Month. Morgan Freeman says, "No, I don't want one." And Chris Wallace asks, "Well, why not?" And he says, "Well," you're Jewish." He goes, "Do you want a Jewish History Month?" And Chris Wallace said no. He goes, "Well, I don't either," because he said, "You're relegating my history to 1 month when my history is American history." And I am not against now, with that said, I want to lay out the pros to Black History Month. You're studying a lot of characters that made some major contributions to the United States. As a matter of fact, it was Christine Johnson, I believe, she was a mathematician. She was African American, very smart. And John Glenn, when getting ready to go to space, she helped send men to the moon. When going to space, John Glenn did not even want to go into space unless she had checked the calculations. So, the point being is that a lot of people like that would be overlooked. So I don't have an issue with that per se, having a month where you study, the African American community or the Black community that has made some major contributions in a very positive way. But they want to talk about Southerners being closed off, and there's a reason why. One major reason why Southerners are closed off, and I kind of maybe explain this a little bit, and this might clear some things up for some people. One of the reasons why that they're so closed off is because it goes back to after the Civil War, and we are having some technical difficulties that we'll have to deal with here in just a second. But it goes back to the Civil War when the carpetbaggers and the scallywags came down, and Abraham Lincoln, when he was still president, he had made a promise that if the farm owners and the plantation owners could keep their farms open, that they weren't going to lose them. But then you had these scallywags and the carpetbaggers that were coming down, and you can still see this today when you're driving down country roads. You will see old houses sometimes where nothing but the chimney standing there, and it was because if they found out that the house was taken away from them, they would burn the house down and leave. And if you've ever watched the movie Gone with the Wind, you see that a lot, right? And that's what they were doing. They were just leaving. So what happened was, and again, I could go down this whole thing. I mean, this is how come this is ultimately why and I want to make this statement, why the KKK claimed that they came into existence was to more or less have oversight of Reconstruction. Now that organization became very evil and probably was from its founding. I want to go on record saying I believe that it probably was from its founding. I'm only stating to you what their initial claim was. And that was they wanted to have oversight of Reconstruction era, because we got to remember Lincoln had been assassinated. So they're claiming, because it was true, the carpetbaggers were coming down and they were stealing land from people, and then they were selling it. And so what happened, and I am not sticking up for any one side over the other. But this goes back. You can go find it. It's on social media. It's somewhere on the internet flying around out there. There is still a disdain for Southerners, a big disdain for Southerners. Because go back to Obama. I mean, what was it he said? That they cling to their God and their guns. And that would lead up to what I wanted you to talk about. Why is there such a hatred for rural Americans?
Well, I think part of the reason they wrote this book, or the premise for it, is white rural Americans are the least dependent on the federal government. If you look at it, I got some statistics from the USDA. 95% of farmers are older white Americans, and they don't need the federal government. And the irony of the statement saying that the white rural Americans are the biggest threat to this country. I haven't seen them out in mass numbers, rioting, burning things down. By and large, they're law-abiding. They just want to be left alone. They want to tend to their farms, tend to their families, and not have to deal with the federal government. I have not looked at the statistics for gun owners.
All right, I think we are back. I apologize, guys, and got someone who's listening. Bo, if you can hear us, please let us know. We just ran into some technical difficulties. These are things to be expected when you go live, and it still says that we are on. So if we were going away, basically, Michael, you were saying that the statistics of the statistics were that. How many?
95% of farmers are white. Now, the way I assess their argument is they're the least dependent on the government, which makes them that's my opinion. That makes them the biggest threat, because they don't need anything from the federal government. If the federal government went belly up, they're still raising cattle, they're still growing food. They're not left wanting. It's going to be people in inner cities who are ironically dependent on those very same farmers.
You're right. Go ahead.
That would quickly become the biggest threat.
You're right. And anyone who's listening to us, again, if we're back on, which we should be, please just type in and let us know if you can hear us or not. But if not, we're just going to keep going. But I don't want to get into the deep weeds of all of this. But that, again, another conversation that I was having. Thank you, Daniel. A conversation that I was having with someone else was that, again, and I'm not into male chauvinism. Okay, I do not believe that women are lesser than. I do not believe that women are subservient to men. But feminism has done a lot to add to the destruction of our nation, because, as you mentioned, that farmers are not dependent on the government. They're not dependent upon any group of people to make their lives work. They do that on their own, and they do it very well.
And most of the time, they've been doing it for generations.
For generations.
Your great grandpappy did it. Your grandpa did it. Your dad did it. And
yes.
so on and so forth.
You're right. And so when you look at, and again, I'm always reluctant, especially as a white guy, to try to speak into something, because I think that sometimes people may take the attitude that I'm trying to say something that I don't understand anything about. But I think I can say this because, I mean, when you can find plenty of people within the black community that will tell you, and Javon, when he was on this podcast, we actually had this conversation with him. So you can go back and hear a similar conversation, not this one, but a similar conversation where he was talking about that one of the problems in the black community was the fact that it was a one household, it was a one parent household. And so what happens is, it is not inherent for a woman to be the provider and to be the strong rock. That is the man. That's the way God created, and that is what God created men to do. Now, I know that doesn't sit well with some people, but that is what God created men to do. And so we've had this situation where they have really been pushing, and I remember a few years ago, and it may still be this, but a few years ago, there was this big celebration of young girls that were getting pregnant out of wedlock. And the problem is that what happens, these women get pregnant, and then they're looking for someone because they've taken the man out of the home, and the provider is gone, the strength is gone, and so the woman starts to look for someone to provide. Because the motherly instinct kicks in, and then the instinct of I've got to take care of my family, I've got to take care of my kid, starts to kick in. And so what do? They look to the government to do it. There has been a huge push, and we can go all the way back to the book of Genesis, and this is what Genesis chapter, I believe it's 18, talks about when Nimrod brings everybody into Babel. That's what he's doing. And so there is this push to get people out of the rural areas, because the idea there is it's not an idea. They know this to be certain that rural people, farmers particularly, they think for themselves.
Well, and they can provide, like I said, they can provide their own food, and they can also hunt. They know how to fish. They know how to skin things. They know how to can things. They know how to survive without a grocery store.
Yes, that's exactly right. They don't need any of that stuff, and there's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with any of that. But see, that's another thing, is there is, I think it comes under the Patriot Act, I believe, which that was a Republican idea. That wasn't the Democrats.
It was a terrible idea.
That you can only have so much water in your house, and I don't remember how many days worth of water that you can actually have before it starts to become, it can actually start to set up red flags. And the point being is that rural America represents independence. Actually, what it represents is true America. I mean, I often say this. I love driving down country roads in small towns. And the reason is because when I go through a small town, it reminds me of what America used to be, where the neighbors knew each other.
They looked out for each other.
Yes.
You need something, then they take care of you.
Yes.
Going back to something you touched on earlier, talking about how they think Southerners are cliquish or closed off. If you've ever traveled to somewhere like Washington, D.C. or New York or some of these other places, the people, not all, but by and large, are far more abrasive. They're more rude. There's an abundance of people who have traveled to the South with that same preconceived notion, and then they go, everybody's so friendly. They say hi, they wave.
Talk about, well, that was one of the things Bill Maher said. Bill Maher said that he loved going to the Midwest because he said when he talked to people in the Midwest that he felt like they were talking to them, or they were talking to him, and they weren't looking over his shoulder to see who the next person was that they needed to meet. because when you get into, like you said, you get into New York, you get into California, and even Nashville. I lived in Nashville, Tennessee for 11 years. One of the things that was always prevalent in the back of your mind was you knew that the person you were talking to wasn't that engaged. I was just driving. I was thinking the other day, going. I remember I was listening to the radio and I hear this guy go, "My good friend," and he names off this big name person, and I'm going, "Yeah, I would be interested in knowing how good of a friend you are. Have you been out to coffee lately? Have you been over to each other's houses? Have you ate dinner from each other's table? Do you talk to one?" And maybe they do. I don't know. I'm not judging that. But when I hear that term, "my good friend," I'm going, I'm curious as to how good a friend you actually are, because it's not in American culture much.
Yeah, I would hazard a guess that most people have an abundance of acquaintances. They're not true friends. True friends I would rather have a small circle of people that I can completely rely on than say that I've got all the quote unquote friends that you call them when you need something and they're nowhere to be found.
Right.
A lot of people throw those terms around rather loosely.
Yes. Yeah. And sometimes they're acquaintances at best.
Yeah, at best. Or you met them once or twice in passing, and somehow now that equates to they're your friend.
Well, and see what they're doing, and again, I'm not. I want to be careful because this is not, when I say 95%, this is not an answer to we just got out of Black History Month. But you said 95% were white Americans, and that, it doesn't matter the color. It does not matter the color. I say that because of this, that the state of Arkansas, the state we live in, Governor Sanders just 2-3 months ago, back in December, was it, told the Chinese they could leave. Now, not the people, but the government, because they were buying up. We talked about this. I think you had already joined the podcast when we talked about this.
Yes,
they were
sir.
buying up acres, and they are all over the country, of farmland, and mostly of them around Air Force bases and military bases.
Yeah, sensitive sites. Anything that's sponsored by a foreign government, especially one with which we have a really tense relationship, I'm really apprehensive because I look at the ulterior motive. Like, I don't think they're simply there to farm. And if the spy balloons give us any indication, I mean, what do you think they're going to do?
Right.
I mean, come on. State-sponsored. Okay, let's backtrack. Would we be comfortable with, given the current state of affairs, allowing Russians to buy up huge swaths of land next to sensitive sites?
No.
Exactly. The Chinese are probably more of a threat than the Russians are. The Chinese have never been our ally. We have used them for cheap labor, to get products made. But if you look at, by and large, they are not our friends. It's foolish. We're allowing the wolves into amongst the sheep.
Right. Well, I mean, you look at our allies and how much land, and we talked about that. I mean, how much land our allies actually have in this country versus what the Chinese have, and it doesn't make any sense at all whatsoever.
I think a lot of times it's that love of money. It comes down to the love of money.
Yes.
They will sell their souls for a little bit of cash. And so, it's the Chinese, well, whatever, we can get rich. And we're not looking at the repercussions or what's this going to mean in a generation or two when they've already got land inside our country, and God forbid we go to war with them or something happens and there's some kind of conflict and there's already...
Well, it goes back to the fifth column, right?
Yeah.
The general who said that he had 4 columns surrounding the city, but it was going to be his 5th column.
Yeah.
And his commanding officer said, "Where's your 5th column?" He said, "It's
Already
inside the
inside.
city."
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's exactly what it comes down to. And some people say, well, that's conspiracy. No, that's not conspiracy. I mean, that's exactly what invading armies do.
That's been a tactic for a long time.
Yes.
And we utilize some of the same tactics ourselves. Don't kid yourself. When we are going to go to war or we're going to invade a country, who goes in first? Special forces, the guys that get on the ground, they start making contacts.
Yeah.
It's not the big mechanized tanks and like what you're used to, the big army. It's We already have people inside.
Well, and the whole idea, you mentioned special forces, the whole idea when JFK commissioned the Green Berets in, was that late 50s, early 60s? When he commissioned them, he told them, he said that, or he didn't tell them, the idea is that the Green Berets would go in and basically they would run a coup, essentially. They would go in and they would train the freedom fighters of those countries, and then they could overthrow the government, and America could be out of country before anyone even knew we were there.
Yeah, and throw a little CIA in the mix. And
And
there you go.
And got people falling out of helicopters, and no, I'm joking. But I mean, the point being is, of course, Vietnam was the first. They want to use the word conflict, but the first war that we utilized the Green Berets to that level, and the problem with that was, I mean, we saw how that went, right? I mean, we saw how that went. The thing is that America gets in, and we get into deep weeds on this, and I don't want to, but America gets into wars, and we don't intend to win, and a lot of that has to do with the UN. I mean, because the moment that a country attacks, and we've seen this, that's why that Russia has been able to stay in the Ukraine as long as they have, because there's no sanctions against them invading Ukraine, not like there would be if they would have invaded Poland or some nation like that. That's the reason why Putin just made the threat that if there's any boots in the ground, that that they will fire off nuclear missiles. Of course, he's been making that threat all along.
And now you've got the French wanting to.
Yeah.
And then the Canadians said that they would, under the condition that they were non-combat troops specifically.
Mm-hmm.
However, I still see that as becoming an issue or leading to a wider conflict.
Absolutely. I mean, what it does is when you try to fight a war proxy, the way that we're doing with this one, it's the same thing that we did. It's the same thing that we did with Afghanistan when the Russians had it back in the late 70s and early 80s. And we tried to make that more or less a payback for Vietnam, because that's what they did. They fought that proxy. The problem is that you're not fighting tactical, and you're not fighting. You are not utilizing strategies that you would know how to utilize if you were actually there yourself. And then what happens is a bunch of money gets spent. This is the reason why that it was President Eisenhower in his farewell speech warned the American people against the military-industrial complex, and because it involved us even more. And this is why that Donald Trump was, again, and this is what they were talking about in that book, that guys like Donald Trump are able to come in and sell the American people. Now, what they're doing is they're kind of making that same comparison about Germany when the Nazis took over in Germany, and that was that they were making the argument that the problem with Germany was the Jewish problem, which they would later call the final solution.
How many wars were fought under Trump?
There you go. There it is right there. And see, and that's what I'm trying to say, because they're trying to say that Trump was, Trump's selling the rural people this idea that America's against you, the rest of the world's against you. Well, that's not the case. I mean, good grief. We all just paid our taxes. We know what's going on. This has nothing to do with some conspiracy theory. This has to do with some very bad policies on the part of our government.
Oh yeah. They're terrible. Like, the way I look at it is, you've got a friend who is a terrible gambler, and they spend all their money and they make poor investments, and they come to you asking for money all the time. I mean, that's the government.
Yes.
I always go back to Reagan when he said the 9 scariest words you could ever hear is, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help."
Who was it? Who was it here a couple of weeks ago said that he said that that Reagan said the best words you could hear. He completely butchered that statement. Did you hear that?
No.
He said he said as Ronald Reagan said, the best 9 words are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help."
Yeah.
Of course, this guy's an extreme far left guy.
Yeah.
And I can't remember. I don't remember his name, and I don't remember what his actual duty was. But I remember him saying that, and I'm going, man, if you're going to quote him right, because he was saying the opposite of that.
Yeah. Well, how many billions of dollars have they just up and lost?
Yeah.
We don't know where it went. It's even more than that now, but we're, $31 trillion in debt now?
Yeah.
I mean, if that was a household budget, you'd already have your car repossessed. You'd be kicked out.
If we ran our household like the government runs, we
you would have nothing.
Right. Well, that was I was a friend of mine. I was having going back to because this leads me back into what we started off talking about. The civil rights was a necessary movement because people were being just stupid Jim Crow laws. People were losing their lives. They were being threatened. They were being terrorized. But I was talking to him. I wasn't talking to him. I was listening to a man talk, and he was African American, and he made a statement. He said even if the civil rights movement had not been signed into law, he said Jim Crow was going to end anyway, because northern businesses were going to start moving down south. And their idea was, I don't care if your skin's black or if it's white. Because you have to remember, Jim Crow didn't just affect black people. White people couldn't go into black businesses either. It was vice versa. I mean, you've got stories right there of Amory, Mississippi, where there was a white guy, I believe he was from Chicago, and he was driving through, and he went into East Amory, and he goes into a restaurant, and it was a black-owned establishment, and he didn't say anything to the guy. He just went back, called the sheriff. The sheriff came in. They arrested the man and threw him in jail for the night. Now, that probably had a lot to do with the way the Old South was, and they saw his out-of-state tag, and they wanted to make an example out of him, make life, and make more money off of him. I would go so far as to say that. But Jim Crow was something that a lot of your northern businesses were going to start coming down south, and they were just going to take people's business and tell the law, the governments down south, look, we don't want this. We're going to take whoever's money, and that comes in here. And one of the questions, and I heard Charlie Kirk ask this question, I thought, man, that's a brilliant question. He said, if the Republican Party is so racist, then tell me why that the South is getting freer and freer and more open to all racial equality, where the Republicans are taking over. And I'm not waving the Republican flag, but that's a very good question. Very good question. And it's really conservatism. And to define what conservatism is, conservatism really just means conserving liberal ideas or our liberties. Conservatism is really classic liberalism is what it is, not the hijacked version that we've got running around today. That George Soros is, he's he just bought up all of the Odyssey radio stations.
No, I hadn't seen that, but it doesn't surprise me. What better way to reach the masses? Well,
and the whole, the thing that was keeping AM alive and keeping conservatism on many radio stations was Rush Limbaugh was alive. Nobody was going to try to come against that machine. EIB, Rush Limbaugh, it just wasn't going to happen. And since his death, they kind of seen their moment to strike. That's the reason why that you're getting all of the parallel economies, and you're getting podcasts like this one and many, many others. I don't know as we'd ever see a Rush Limbaugh-esque, maybe Joe Rogan, but I don't know as we'd ever see a Rush Limbaugh-esque podcaster because there's so many podcasters. I guess you could have that one guy who does things so well, and that everybody gravitates to them. But nobody wanted to deal with Rush Limbaugh on those stations. Well, now Soros goes and he buys all those up, and very timely, right? We got
right before an election,
and that's the thing with the Democrat Party. I mean, the Democrat Party has been bought and paid for by George Soros. I mean, you look at the states that have fired George Soros-funded DAs. I mean, and they're in states that now. No. I mean, the states now where Trump is being heavily prosecuted for crimes that they can't prove that he committed them.
Well, okay, so it's real simple. In order for a crime to have occurred, you have to have a victim. Like this whole real estate mess in New York, there's no victim.
Right.
So how do you justify $335 million?
Yeah.
What I think it is they're trying to take away the money for his campaign, cripple him financially, drag his name through the mud. Like there's a lot of motives there.
Right.
But also to tie him up because, if you're having to go to court and you're having to deal with all this stuff, you can't be out campaigning.
No.
But I think the more they do that, the more a lot of people look at him and go, look at how bad, like they really don't want him. There's a reason. I think a lot of people are smarter than they're given credit in that respect. Like they can see through the political motivation.
Yeah.
And they understand that this is just driven by politics. The other thing is New York's economy is failing. And now that they're bringing in busloads of illegal immigrants and they're now putting them in schools and they're paying, incredible amounts of money and giving them money to go and spend. Well, what better way than get after somebody and take $335 million from them?
Well, you just heard where Nikki Haley said that Trump's legal issues needed to be addressed. Of course, that's because she's losing.
Well,
horribly.
That's because she talks out of both sides of her mouth.
Yeah. And I say that because, again, I want everyone to understand this is not a pro-Trump day, okay? I'm saying that because it's the same reason why Bernie Sanders was doing so well. People are just getting tired of the establishments on both sides. And
which is exactly why Bernie got pushed out of his own political party as far as the candidacy goes.
Right.
Because he should have had the candidacy, but they didn't want him.
Right.
They want to keep the same clique or establishment that they've already got. They don't want anybody that's going to break the mold.
Well, and it goes back to what you just said. I mean, Haley talks out of both sides of her mouth because one minute she's saying, innocent till proven guilty. Now she's saying, well, it needs to be because she's not going to win. She knows that. There's no chance for her.
She can't win in her own home state.
Right.
So, I mean,
and that's embarrassing enough. It's going to look. It's time to drop out.
Yeah, just hang it up and call it a year.
But all of that goes to say what we've started this whole conversation off with, and that is they fear the rural Americans, white, black, Hispanic, Asian. It does not matter. If you are living in a rural area, they fear you because they know you are a free thinker.
Well, and like I said, the government has really grown to promote dependence.
Yes.
Not independence.
Yes.
Because dependence leads to reliance.
Yes.
And therefore, if you have a dissenting view, it's easily squashed. Okay, well, it's like I've brought it up before, but, China and their social credit score. Okay, well, you said something that we don't like, so you're going to be blocked from using public transport, or you're not going to be able to purchase groceries, or these are the people that won't be affected by those kinds of policies.
Right.
You're not going to receive your check from the government. They don't care. They don't need it in order to survive. That's what makes them a threat, is their lack of dependence on the establishment.
You're right, and see something else that you mentioned, and this is what's really funny. We heard so much about the EV vehicles. Remember that they were supposed to take over by 2030, and have you noticed now
they're having to push it back?
Well, they're not just pushing it back. Now they're almost becoming evil, and you're going, okay, why do electric vehicles all of a sudden go from being hero to zero? Until you realize. Again, you want to talk about people talking out both sides of the mouth. They hate rural Americans, but guess what? Another thing that we just did in Arkansas, that Sanders did, is she's running those tests to get to mine that, right? Because China owns the cobalt mines in Afghanistan since we pulled out, and that with that debacle, they went in there and took all that up. So it becomes a national security threat, which is the real national security threat, which they're having to admit China's a national security threat.
Yeah.
So when
but we're going to allow them to buy land here,
Yeah.
no problem.
Yeah, and that's why you're going, okay, so you're saying you admit they're a national security threat when it comes to why? Because first off, they're a national security threat. But the real reason, let's face what the real reason is. This goes for guys like Mitch McConnell too. They're okay with China until it starts dealing with their money. And that's why they hate Donald Trump. That's the reason why Donald Trump is being as heavily persecuted as he is because that he was dealing with their money. I mean, he was stealing away from their latchkey kid fund, and the American people were benefiting from their work, their own work of their own hands, and there was the problem. That's the unpardonable sin in Washington, D.C.
Well, ill-gotten gains profiteth no man, and that's what Trump was cutting a lot of that off. Well, and I am all for domestic production. If we can make it here, I don't mind spending more money to get a product that's made here,
right?
That's keeping people employed. I dislike the idea of being dependent on other countries to get all of our goods, and that's what we've started trickling back towards. We had gone away from that and kind of stepped up steel production and mining and drilling and getting oil here. We were independent.
Yeah.
I'm all for that.
Well,
we don't need the rest of the world.
No, and I just pulled up. It was February 28th, so 2 years ago almost. Well, a little over 2 years ago. Almost exactly February 28th. But the Congolese, is that how you say it? The Congolese? No, Congolese rather. Sorry, the Congolese government kicked the Chinese government out. They owned all the cobalt mines in the Congo. So if a country like Congo is smart enough to go, hey, China's not, and Costa Rica did the same thing.
Because they realized they were just being exploited for a much larger game. We're playing a giant chess game, and a lot of these smaller countries find themselves being used as pawns, and so they're wising up.
Well, and and we're coming to the end, and again, as I said, as I've always said on here, we always look at things through a scriptural viewpoint, and everything we've talked about today, I will end what I'm saying on this note, that in Deuteronomy, God tells the children of Israel, if you keep my commands and you keep my statutes and keep my commands, then you will live in houses you did not build, and you will eat vineyards that you did not plant. But if you do not, and you forsake them, then others, foreigners, will come in, and they will live in houses that you built, and they will eat vineyards that you planted. And that has been the thing. America has forsaken the covenant that we made with God so many years ago. Now, I've said it, and I still say it, that America is ripe for a third great awakening, and I hope that we see one. I pray every day that we see one. But at the end of the day, part of what we're dealing with is the fact that America has decided not so much what we've done is our government always represents the people. And a lot of people will go and vote for certain politicians without knowing who they're voting for. And not knowing is a sin, because the Bible says you who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is a sin. What is good is for you to know, and we're coming up to an election time. Talk to your friends, get yourself informed, know who you're voting for.
Well, and don't take a politician's word, regardless of who they are. Use the old adage, trust but verify.
That's right.
Okay, politicians get elected by making promises they can't keep.
Yeah.
But use your deductive reasoning, use your intelligence, go out and look look at the statistics, look at the information that's out there, and create a well-informed opinion, and then know whether what they're saying is reliable or not. Because just like a 9mm will blow somebody's lung out. No, it won't. That's absolute nonsense. If you look at real empirical data, that does not happen.
Well, what was one of them said the other day that an M16 will rip a person in two, something of that nature.
Yeah, it's absolutely obscene. They were talking about you can't hunt deer with an AR-15 because there's no meat left. Like, I'm not sure you understand. It's just a hopped up 22. Could it take a deer down? I don't even, honestly.
I don't think I would want to hunt with one.
No, I don't think
certainly
it's
none of the wild boar that run around here.
If I had to, there's a difference. But I would much rather use a larger caliber round for hunting.
Yeah.
You know, but they tell you these things, or they come up with these exorbitant numbers for stuff that it's just simply not true, and it's not reasonable. Mm-hmm. And if you do, 10 minutes worth of research, you can be much more informed.
Yes, and that's it right there. It is incumbent. It is your responsibility to know who you're voting for, who represents you, because if you go in there and you cast a vote, you're held responsible. Ignorance, even with the law, ignorance is not an excuse. And to go in and say, well, I didn't think they would do this. Well, you could have known they were going to do this, because they said that had they have known about Hunter's laptop in 2020, that would have changed the outcome by, I think it was like 17%. That was enough to swing the vote and keep Joe Biden out of office. Why did that happen? Because you had too many low information voters who chose not to inform themselves. It's not, that's why, we are not a news podcast. We are not a journalist podcast. But, there are so much stuff out there that will allow people to be informed. The biggest thing is rhetoric, guys. I mean, people ask, do I need a college degree to succeed? Absolutely not. But I would say go down and either invest in a library card or go to Barnes & Noble and start buying some books. Start renting some books from libraries and educating yourself. Our founding fathers used primarily Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith and Leviathan by John Locke. I mean, they used those to figure out what was the best form of economy, among many other things. And that is what we have to do. But I'm going to, as we always do, say this has been a great exchange. And again, please tell your friends, like, subscribe, and share, and keep listening. Thank you for those that were listening today, and tell your friends about us. And Michael, take us out, man.
I really appreciate everyone who takes the time to listen to these, and feel free to leave us with some feedback so we kind of know what direction y'all want us to head, and give us some ideas on topics that you'd like discussed. And if we think it's a good fit, we'll make it work. Like he said, we always appreciate your support. So if you can, it's real simple to click the like and share, send your friends and family our way, and see what we can all accomplish together.
Sounds good, man. And we will see you next week.